Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join us as we share our journey in developing the Teacher Data Use Survey. It was just released last week, so we are very excited to talk about it and give you an overview of the survey today. I'm Stephanie Wilkerson, President of Magnolia Consulting. I've been a member of the REL Appalachia team for the past 4 years. And my partner in crime on this project and fellow co-author on this survey is Dr. Jeffrey Wayman, who joins us today. He's president of Wayman Services. Also want to give a shout out to our other 3 co-authors on the Teacher Data Use Survey who are not on this webinar today, who are out in the field promoting data use through their respective organizations. And they are Vincent Cho with Boston College, Ellen Mandanock with West Ed, and Jonathan Sapovitz with the University of Pennsylvania. I had mentioned that I have been supporting REL Appalachia, which for those of you who are not familiar is one of 10 regional educational laboratories. The labs serve regions within the country. The Appalachia region is Virginia, West Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. The contract is administered through the U.S. Department of Education's Institute of Education Sciences with the overarching goal of really bridging the gap between research and practice. And we do this by partnering with schools and districts, intermediate service agencies, education cooperatives, and other state agencies. And we do this by providing technical assistance and research, literature reviews, hands-on workshops in areas that reflect the needs of the region. And in REL Appalachia, some of those focus areas include the early warning systems, college and career readiness, effective data use, literacy, numeracy instruction, and classroom technology. I also want to acknowledge that the work that we've been doing that really kind of gave rise to the Teacher Data Use Survey came from a partnership that REL Appalachia has with Metro Nashville Public Schools. They helped with the piloting of the survey and provided great feedback that ensures its validity for use in schools across the country. So we want to give a big thank you to them, and some of them are on our call today. So while we hope to maintain your focus here on the webinar, if you feel excited and compelled to share what you're hearing with the rest of the world, we encourage you to do so. So please tweet if you have a moment, whether it's sharing what you're hearing or encouraging somebody to join a future webinar on the Teacher Data Use Survey. We hope that you will take a moment to do that. So before we delve into the details of the Teacher Data Use Survey, we want to learn a little bit about you and who's on the call. So you're going to see some poll questions pop up for you to respond to. We have 3 of them that will help us get a feel for why you're here. So you'll see over in the bottom right-hand side 3 poll questions. You might need to cursor down a little bit to get to that 3rd question. So the first question, what is your role? How are you showing up today on this call? The second question, if you are a school or a district person, do you intend to administer this survey in the next few months? And then the 3rd question, if you're not a school or district person, do you work with a group or an entity that you think is likely to give this survey in the next few months? And we know some of these questions might be a little early in the game, given that the survey just came out to the public last week, and perhaps your answers to these will change as you learn more about the survey, but we want to get a feel for where you are now in your thinking about the Teacher Data Use Survey. Also just want to point out that we do ask about different roles that you represent today, because we do feel the Teacher Data Use Survey, this webinar, and our future webinars are relevant for a variety of educators, not just for administrators. We have different versions of the survey and feel that it can serve to benefit and inform education practices for people serving in different roles, and that's why we ask about who's showing up today. I think just a couple more seconds and we'll see our responses here. The poll has closed. Should be seeing results. Okay. So it looks like we have a variety of people. We have some that are falling into the other category and others that chose not to answer in terms of who they're representing. We've got district representation as well as external organizations. We have, all right, one intrepid user already in a school or district using the teacher survey, and others who chose not to answer right now. We hope maybe we'll provide you with more information that can help guide that decision in the future. And it looks like there are some folks on the call who are also interested in using the survey in the future who are not with a school or district but work with entities. So that's fantastic. Thank you for your time in responding to the questions. All right, so what I want to point out is this is the first of 4 webinars. So we will be back at the same bat time, same bat channel for the next 3 Fridays to delve a little bit more deeply into different aspects of the Teacher Data Use Survey. Today we're providing a general overview, and next Friday we're going to talk a little bit more about customization, which is a truly unique feature of this survey that we think is of great value and benefit to users of the survey. In webinar 3, we'll talk about administration practices of the survey. This is a survey that can be administered online as well as print. We'll talk about trade-offs with that as well as logistics and best practices in administration. And then for webinar 4, we'll be talking about communicating the results from the various surveys. We've got 3 different versions. So that will be an exciting one to attend as well because we really want to emphasize use of the results. That's what we're all here about. So a couple of things. If you're not able to make all 4 webinars, that's okay. These are being recorded and will be archived and available on the REL website. You will receive a link via email with access to those recorded archives. Also, it's important to note that say you're not able to make webinar 2 or 3, but you can join us for 4. At the beginning of each of our following webinars, we'll spend just a couple minutes going over some of the key points that we addressed in the prior webinars. So it's not a prerequisite that you attend all of them. We hope you will. We obviously feel like each one has important information to share with you. It also allows you as practitioners to interact with us and ask questions during that time, questions that might be relevant for others on the webinar as well. So we hope you will join us in as many of these as possible, if not all. So for today's webinar, we're going to talk a little bit about the benefits to practitioners and researchers for using the Teacher Data Use Survey. We're also going to introduce you to the conceptual framework that underlines the survey itself. So this really gets at the theory and why we feel like that we wanted the survey to measure what it's measuring based on our theoretical understanding of changes in practice around data use. Jeff is also going to talk about the specific survey items and scales and give you an introduction to what we are measuring in the survey. So if you haven't had a chance to look at the survey yet or the accompanying resources, there is a link here. I believe that the link was included in an email that was sent to you prior to this webinar. What you'll find when you click on that link are PDF versions of each of the 3 versions of the survey. That link is now in our chat box. You'll see the version for teachers, for administrators, and for instructional support staff. You'll also see a PDF of the administration guide that we created to accompany the survey. You'll also see an additional tool for reporting, and this is an Excel database where you can enter data from all 3 surveys and where it generates a Word narrative report as well as a 4-page dashboard report. If you follow this link, you'll see a link to an example dashboard report. We'll be talking about those on our 4th webinar, November 4th. So that's the link to the resources of the survey. And with no further ado, I am going to hand this over to Jeff Wayman so he can walk you through the purpose, benefits, and development of the survey.
Mrs. Jeff Wayman. There went a beat. That could have been me restarting. So Stephanie, thank you. As Stephanie said, my name is Jeff Wayman. I am an education consultant with Wayman Services, LLC. I'm a former professor. I've spent the last 15 years researching data use and how teachers can more easily use data, first at Johns Hopkins University, then at the University of Texas, and now in my current life as a consultant. And part of this research is doing things like the TDUS. And so I'm really happy that we got to do this, and I'm very happy that we're here. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the TDUS itself, the purpose of it, what you can get from it, the benefits, and how we developed the TDUS. So I've written in my work more than one time that data use lives and dies in the principal's office. And a big part of why that's true is that principals are charged with leading teachers in using data. And the truth is, while data use lives and dies in the principal's office, that it is impossible to have an effective school-wide or district-wide data initiative without all the teachers being on board. If you have pockets of use and pockets of non-use, then you have a less than healthy data initiative. Teacher data use is the most important thing. Teachers are the most important data users if we're aiming for educational improvement. But there's this funny thing that we have done in education, which is that we have told teachers, use data, be evidence-used, or I'm sorry, use data, be evidence-based, and so on over and over and over. Yet, all of the information that we typically have about teacher data use in a school or district is not evidence-based. It's anecdotal. It's things that a leader might hear about how teachers are using data. And so that's one of the reasons why we have the Teacher Data Use Survey, is that this enables leaders, school and district leaders, to be more evidence-based in knowing how their teachers use data, in their attitudes that teachers have towards data, their perceptions of data, how they use data. So the TDUS then can establish an evidence base for helping us know more about teacher data use. What do you get from using the Teacher Data Use Survey? Well, the main thing is you get a complete picture of teacher data use. I'll talk a little more about this here in a second, but we actually have three versions of the TDUS. We have one that asks teachers what they do with data, but we also have one that asks administrators about teacher data use and asks instructional support staff about teacher data use. So that gives a comprehensive picture. You can also include the entire teacher population in your school or district. You don't typically need to worry about sampling because it's almost always as easy to give this to everybody in your organization than it is to just a few people. So that's one benefit, is a comprehensive picture of teacher data use. As I mentioned before, this establishes an evidence base. And from this evidence base, you can plan professional learning for data use, much better than if you're going on anecdotal information. You can plan how you're going to use your computer data systems. You'll know which data are most important to them and their attitudes towards how technology can support them. You can plan your support, where you can best place your resources in terms of helping teachers use data better to support their practice. You can include the results of the survey in your long-term strategic planning, because I'll tell you, if your long-term strategic plan doesn't account for data use, you're in trouble. And by account for data use, I don't mean just I have the words data in use in my long-term strategic plan. I mean that if you haven't accounted in your long-term plan about how data are going to inform our long-term plan at every turn, then you're in a bit of trouble. And so the TDUS can help you with that. You can look at trends with this. You can give it in multiple years and find out how attitudes and uses are changing, because I'll tell you, attitudes and use of data are always going to be changing. One of the best parts about the TDUS is it offers teachers a voice. You're asking their opinions, and if you use those opinions, you have established a feedback loop. You've established a way for the teacher population at large to talk to you about what they think about data use. So how did this come about? Well, About 5-8 years ago, I was working with Vincent Cho and Shanna Shaw on some projects, and we wrote a survey called the Survey of Educator Data Use. I'd worked with John Zapovitz on another survey before that, but with these surveys, we always knew that there were improvements that needed to be made. In fact, John Zapovitz and Ellen Mandenack and Vincent Cho and I always talked about, gosh, we should somehow find funding to put our heads together and create a survey using all of our knowledge, because we all had used surveys in our research. Well, REL Appalachia had a need for creating a survey, so I was fortunate enough to lead this team, this research team, in creating a new survey that improved over the stuff that we had done before. As I mentioned, Vincent and Ellen and John and I had worked together at different points. We were fortunate enough through this project to meet Stephanie Wilkerson, my co-presenter here, who had been doing her own work in data use for a number of years. And so Stephanie brought a new perspective to the project, and the 5 of us ended up making a really good research team. We locked ourselves inside a room in Austin, Texas for 2 days, created the survey. We piloted the survey in Metro Nashville Public Schools through the help of Margie Johnson. By piloting it, I mean that we gave it to a number of teachers and checked it for its psychometric qualities to make sure that it was acting okay. But we also did a thing called cognitive labs. When you do these cognitive labs, you're sitting with a teacher while you're taking the survey, and you're asking them questions about the survey. Hey, you know, how's this striking you? Did you understand this? And so on. The end product is a really, really good survey. It went through the IES peer review process. We had help from REL Appalachia with their editors and their expertise. Our peer review board, by the way, with IES did an excellent job. It's a much better survey because of their suggestion and REL Appalachia input. And so the end result is this really good survey that you get to use. So as I mentioned earlier, there are 3 versions of the TDUS. We don't just ask teachers about their data use. What I have learned from visiting schools and talking to them about data use is that if we do a focus group in a school, say with teachers or an administrative team, we'll hear one thing, and when we go next door to talk to the next focus group from that school, say we talk to teachers first, then we're going to go talk to the administrative team, sometimes it's like we got in a car and drove across town. You'll hear sometimes a completely different thing. And so we knew it was important not just to ask teachers, but to also ask administrators what they were seeing about teacher data use, and ask the instructional support staff who work with teachers what they're seeing about teacher data use. And so in this way, as you can see in the diagram down below, we triangulate opinions about teacher data use, and that gives a full picture of teacher data use. We ask the same questions on all 3 surveys, so there isn't a new set of questions, but we ask them differently. So as you see on the example here, we might ask the teachers, are the following forms of data available to you? Administrators, we would ask, are the following forms of data available to your teachers? And instructional support staff, are the following forms of data available to the teachers you support? So that's a little bit about the history and how the TDUS came to be. One of the things that we did as a research team is we wanted to make sure that our survey was research-based. In other words, we wanted to make sure that whatever we were asking about was supported by all the latest research in data use, some of which we ourselves had conducted. And so we set about, the first thing we did was set about creating a conceptual framework. The 5 of us put our heads together and basically said, how do the 5 of us think teacher data use works? And so I want to describe this conceptual framework for you so that you see why we have these things that we have on the TDUS. Okay, so there's your conceptual framework. The framework is based on the actions that teachers take with data. And that's the thing that you see in the center there. We think it starts with those actions. And we posited that the actions that teachers take with data follow a cycle of sorts. That is, that they would ask questions, they'd examine data, they would turn that data into information, they would make decisions, put it in practice, evaluate what they did, maybe go form more questions, and it acts in a cycle there. I'm sure if you've done any work with teacher data use that you've seen a number of different cycles. And our thinking was that these actions that teachers take with data will affect their knowledge and practice in positive ways, we hope, that they'll know more about their students, they'll know more about their own craft, and that they will improve the things that they do in teaching and in working with students. And the idea from there is that if they know more and if they're better teachers, then student learning will increase. So starting in the middle there, we think that if teachers take the proper actions with using data, that they can improve their knowledge, they can improve their practice, and that should result in student learning. But here's the deal. One of the problems that we've had for the last 15 years in implementing data use is that way too many schools and districts start and end with the actions part. That is, they have told the teachers, here's some data, now go take action with it, go use it. And the research is very, very clear that these actions don't happen without a number of different supports. So that's what you see in the 4 bubbles on the far left. That is, the actions that teachers take with data are affected by their competence in using data, how good they are at it. And if you look at the arrow that's going from competence to actions, you'll see that's a double-headed arrow, meaning that increased competence will make your actions better, but also as you go through these actions a number of times, you gain competence in using data, so that's a reciprocal relationship. Your attitudes towards using data, teachers' attitudes affect their actions. And again, this is reciprocal. If your attitudes are positive towards data, you will probably have improved actions, and as your actions continue to go along and as they improve, your attitudes should improve. We posited that collaboration supports these actions, because the thing I always say is no matter how important we think collaboration is today, it's more important. We'll find out tomorrow it was even more important than we ever thought. Collaboration is the lifeblood of teacher data use, and so that affects actions. Also, there are a number of organizational supports that affect actions. Things like computer data systems and professional learning and administration, leadership, things like that. If you notice here, these organizational supports don't just support actions, but they also support the other supports. So organizational supports affect actions, they support collaboration, they support attitudes towards data use, and they support teachers' competence in using data. Now, the TDUS itself does not measure everything in here. What we measure is the actions, and we measure the supports for those actions. The TDUS doesn't measure knowledge and practice, nor does it measure student learning. Those are their own animals, and there are a number of surveys out there that measure those things. It was beyond the scope of this project. The scope of this project was to measure the things that have to do directly with teacher data use. And that's the actions that teachers take with data and the supports for those actions. So to do this, now I'm going to talk more about this in our next segment, but I want to give you an overview of what we're talking about. The teacher data use survey is made up of a number of different items, and those items can be grouped together to measure scales, things that we call scales, so these are conceptually similar items. So for instance, actions is measured by a scale that we call the actions with data scale. The actions component is also measured by collaborative team actions, because we sat down, once we created this conceptual framework, we said, okay, now we have to measure these things. And we did it using these scales. The competence in using data component, the bubble up on the top left, is measured by the data competence scale. The attitudes toward data component is measured by 2 scales. Data's effectiveness for pedagogy and attitudes towards data. Collaboration is measured by collaborative team trust. Organizational supports is measured by 3 scales. Support for data use, principal leadership, and computer data systems. In addition, we have some individual items that measure these components. So it's not just scales, but for the actions component, we have a bunch of individual items that ask how often teachers use data, specific forms of data, to plan for instruction, and we'll talk about that later. Competence in using data and collaboration are only measured by scales. They don't have individual items. The attitudes towards using data component is measured by individual items that ask them how useful specific forms of data are to teacher practice. And organizational support is measured by specific items that say, do you have these specific forms of data available to you? So all this stuff, this is kind of a setup for our next section that we are, that we're going to go with. But I'll ask you now that we're going to stop and do a poll. I want to know, whenever I talked about the pieces of this conceptual framework, so the actions and the supports, which of these bubbles really stood out to you? Which ones are you encountering in your own work as a priority for the school that you work for the district you work for the organization you represent, for the type of work that you do? So use the poll on your right there to select one of those 5. If I can, I'm going to bump back to the, Jennifer, I hope this doesn't mess up the poll. And I'm going to bump back to the conceptual framework. So you can look at that a second while you're filling out your poll. And we will offer the results soon. I'm seeing here that it's got a time limit of 5 minutes, but I think we'll just take a minute to get these poll answers in. While you are doing this poll, I'll tell you that that our next section, we're going to talk about the specifics of the teacher data use survey. So all those things that I ran through really quickly when I was talking about scales and all that, we're going to talk about specific items and how you specify these things. Looks like we have poll results. Always exciting when the data comes in. Organizational support. First of all, I'm ashamed of all of you that the highest answer is no answer. That's a joke. But actually the highest answer is organizational support. That's the thing that stands out the most to people. Competence in using data is also very high. Interesting that nobody on the webinar anyway is cited attitudes towards data as their very first priority. So anyway, thank you for answering that. That gives us a sense of, and it gives you a sense of the sorts of things that other people are working on. So let's get to the items and scales that are on the TDUS. So here's the way the TDUS goes. You've got on the TDUS, you have things set up in blocks of questions that ask about similar things. So as I said before, the teachers might encounter a block of items, I can't remember how many there are, maybe 8, that ask about their collaborative actions that they take with their teams. Or they might have 4 or 5 that deal with computer data systems. So that's what they'll encounter, and each one of these individual items has a 4-point response scale, Likert scale, that is appropriate for the type of question that's being asked. So if we ask how often does something happen, maybe the lowest answer on the scale is less than once a month. Maybe the highest answer is weekly. We've got a lot of opinion scales on there, so strongly disagree to strongly agree. The best way to handle missing data is to have no missing data, and so therefore we don't allow missing data on the teacher data use survey. There are a couple of exceptions for this, and these aren't really missing data, but we had to have options for people who weren't able to answer certain types of questions. So like if we ask you if you have access to a particular type of data, say state data, and you don't use this, then actually, sorry, I shouldn't say that for the access, but if we ask you how often you use state data and you never use it, then we should allow that as a response. And so that's there. If you are an administrator or an instructional support staff member and you don't know a particular thing about teacher data use, you don't know maybe how they use this particular data point, you've got an option to say, I don't know on that also. So that's how the items on the TDUS looks. Here's what, in my opinion, is the biggest improvement on the TDUS from the CDU, our survey that we had before. Before, and in other surveys that I've seen, we ask about data generically. So we say, maybe we get at frequency of data use by saying, how often do you use data? That's what happened before. What we decided in our little room in Austin, Texas for 2 days was that answer depends on what data you're using. So if you ask a teacher how often they use state data, like a state achievement test, that's going to be a different answer than if you ask them how often they use, say, their own tests and quizzes. So we made it to where the teacher data use survey can be customized to allow schools and districts to ask about specific data points that they have in their context. And so those data points in this district are going to be different than the ones in this other district from one to another. We categorized, what we did was we decided that there were 4 types of data that we were interested in. One of them is what we called state data. And that's data such as, main form of state data is the state test. And so if you're in Florida, it's the FCAT. If you're in Texas, it's a STAR. And so districts can ask about their specific state data. Another form of data is periodic data, what we call periodic data. These are like interim benchmark assessments that are given a handful of times a year, 3 to 4 times a year. And many of these are commercially available. Things like DIBELS is a good example, Ames Web Acuity. The other 2 categories, one of them is local data, and that's the things that are written within a particular local agency, like a school or a district. And so examples of local data would be maybe the math team in this particular school gets together and writes a common assessment, or maybe the English team throughout the district writes a common assessment to be used throughout the district. But we wanted to distinguish, these things can also be, local data can be given in terms of like interim benchmarks or something. Common assessments are often done that way. But we wanted to be able to distinguish between stuff that is developed elsewhere, like commercially assessments, and assessments that are developed locally, that we wrote ourselves because they were pertinent to our context. Finally, the 4th category of data that people can ask about on the TDUS is personal data. It's super important. One of the things that I pick at with data use is that many people act as though that the teachers never had data before 2002, and that's not right. Teachers have been using data for 100 years, and we want to know about those forms of data. So there's personal data that schools and districts should ask about, and these are things like my tests, my quizzes, portfolios, the assessments that I might give at the end of a unit. So what happens here is that the schools and districts sit down, whoever is planning the survey sits down and says, okay, what specific forms of data do we have in each one of these categories? So what forms of data do we have in state data? Write those down. Name them. What forms of data do we have in periodic data? Well, we give this. All right, write it down. And on the survey itself, teachers and the survey recipients never see the words state data and periodic data and local data and personal data. What they see are names of data points that they understand, that matter to them. And so we're going to go through some examples that will show you what that looks like. There is no limit to how many a school or district, whoever's planning the survey, can choose on these. Put as many as you want to. And you don't have to have something in each one of these categories either. And so we'll go through some examples of how this looked. So this slide goes through a bit of what I just said, but the way this is structured is that you've got a set of upfront questions that ask the participants about their access to certain data, about how often they use those data, and how useful those forms of data are to them. So, for instance, if the survey planners want to ask about state data, then they'll name the state data. If it were here in Texas, it would be the STAR. And so there's a set of questions that say, do you have access to the STAR? How often do you use the STAR? And how useful is the STAR to you? And it asks that for every data point that the district or school has decided to put in there. Following this, so this is every data point that they care about. Following this is a second set of questions that asks very detailed questions about how they use these data. And for these, because these questions are so detailed, we ask them to choose only one data point per category to ask about. So pick one form of state data, pick one form of periodic data, pick one form of local data, pick one form of personal data, and we'll ask detailed questions about how you go ahead and use those. Again, you don't have to have something from every category. When we piloted this with Metro Nashville, I can't remember which category it was, but they had a category that went completely unused. So I promised you an example. Let's look at an example from a hypothetical district in Arizona. We haven't worked with this survey with anybody in Arizona. It's just that we had to pick a state, and Arizona was the one that we picked. Here's what that looks like. The very first question we said was the first set of questions asked about access to specific forms of data. So for our hypothetical district, they chose AZ Merit as their state data. That's the state test in Arizona. So they ask, teacher, do you have AZ Merit available to you? And they say yes or no. Let's say that this district chose acuity from their periodic data, or as their form of periodic data. They put that on there. Let's say that this district also chose the three different district benchmarks that they've written themselves as local data. So that would be what they call the BOI, MOI, and EOI. So they give these district benchmarks that they wrote themselves, local data, 3 times a year, at the beginning of the year, at the middle of the year, and at the end of the year. And then for personal data, they're interested in end-of-unit tests that teachers give and homework that teachers give. And so this, and then of course there's an opportunity for teachers to say other, and then they can write that in. So the first thing we're doing is the survey planners said, okay, here are specific names of data points that our teachers know about, and we're going to ask if you have access to these forms of data. And as we'll talk about in Webinar 2, there's some skip logic that if you don't have access to it, then it sends you to a different place. But as you see, this is a list that was created and specifically by the district themselves. Teachers and principals and instructional coaches don't have to look at this and think, well, what do I mean by state data, or shit, what do you mean by data? We're asking them, is acuity available to you? And so it's specific, and that's a good thing. We move from access to frequency. And so in the upper left-hand corner of that diagram, or the picture in the left-hand corner, asks about frequency. How often, how frequently do you use the following forms of data? You see that this is the exact same list as before. Then we move to ask, how useful are these following forms of data to your practice? So we've asked Do you have access to them? How often do you use them? How useful are they? And it's the same set of data for each one. From there, so we've gotten a picture of that'll tell you about all the data points that you're interested in your school or district. From there, we want to ask about specific uses, the actions that are taken by teachers with data. And so we have a set of 8 very specific questions, but you don't want to ask all 8 questions about every form of data that you've had before. You'll kill them if you do that. People will quit the survey. So what we say is from each one of the 4 categories, state data, periodic data, local data, personal data, pick one. This district picked AZ Merit for their state data. And here are the questions that we ask them about specific uses. So how often do you use AZ Merit, their state test, to identify instructional content to use in class? How often do you use it to tailor instruction to individual student needs? How often do you use it to develop recommendations for additional instructional support? And so on. So we ask these 8 questions about that specific form of data. And in doing so, we do that not just about that one point, but about one data point from each of the 4 categories. So here are the other 3 categories. This hypothetical district chose acuity from their periodic data list. They chose EOY from their local data list. And they chose end-of-unit tests from their personal data list. So this is a really good thing because this enables schools and districts to ask their teachers about very specific uses of very specific forms of data, and it's a wealth of information. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the various components, the various scales that we have that measure these components of the conceptual framework. So we're going to start at the bottom left there. One scale that measures organizational supports is the supports for using data scale. An example of questions that go into this scale are things like, I'm adequately supported in the effective use of data. There's someone who answers my questions about using data. There are a number of questions that make up this scale. That helps us know about this particular piece of the organizational supports component. As I mentioned before, the attitudes towards data component is measured by 2 scales: data's effectiveness for pedagogy and attitudes towards data. Examples of these questions are we ask them their opinion. We ask them to rate whether they agree or disagree with these statements. Data help teachers plan instruction. Another example is I find data useful. They say how much they agree or disagree. And there are actually a number of questions that make up both of those scales. Principal support. We ask questions about how principals and assistant principals lead their schools. And for teachers, that looks like these types of questions. For example, my principal or assistant principals create many opportunities for teachers to use data, or made sure that teachers have had plenty of training for data use. Now, of course, we ask that differently for the principals and assistant principals themselves. Then it's in the form of I create many opportunities for my teachers to use data, and so on. So another scale is the computer data systems scale. That also is part of the organizational supports component. And we ask questions like computer data systems provide me with access to lots of data, they're easy to use, and a number of other questions. Data competence asks things like, I'm good at using data to diagnose student learning needs, good at adjusting instruction based on data. That measures the data competence component. Collaborative data teams, there are a lot of questions on there about this. We ask about, we have 2 scales that deal with collaboration. One of them goes to the collaboration component, and that one asks about trust. So like it's okay for me to discuss feelings and worries with other members of my team. That one is borrowed from the Chicago Consortium. Another one goes with the actions, and that asks about what they do with data. This one kind of follows a cycle, but an example of one question is we identify questions that we will seek to answer using data. So that's an overview of the Teacher Data Use Survey. We will go into more detail in Webinar 2, but this gives you a sense of what the survey is about, what it looks like, how we came up with it, what you can do with it, and how you can benefit from it. At this point, hopefully people, as they have had questions, have been putting them in the chat pod as they went along. Jennifer has been organizing these questions, and so we want to take a few minutes here to answer any questions that you may have about the Teacher Data Use Survey. If you have a question and you haven't yet put it in, then go ahead and start typing it in, and we can get started answering these. Jennifer is going to fire them at us, and either Stephanie or I will handle the questions. So, Jen, it's all you.
Okay, Jeff, we have a first question that asks, in regards to the survey, does this have to be given online or paper and pencil, or is there an option for how it's administered?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll take that one. Stephanie, feel free to chime in if you want to. We wrote this so it's written to be given with paper and pencil because that's the most basic form, right? But as we were thinking about it, we were really thinking about online software. So you can give this either way, with either paper and pencil or online software. If you have the capacity to do online software, we recommend that. There are a lot of benefits, easier to give, easier to take. Just depends on what your context is. We say a little bit more about that in the manual, and we talk about that in an upcoming webinar.
Okay, great, thank you. The next question is, if I'm interested in utilizing the survey and I have questions about how to go about that or where do I get started or anything, even others who are already using it, questions that they may have, are you and Stephanie available as a resource for me to contact?
Absolutely. I love having conversations about this stuff. So by all means, email me, whether it's questions about the survey, other forms of data use. I will always respond to your emails. Always happy to do that. So definitely count me in. Steph, what about you?
Yep, absolutely. And we would encourage questions really from the gamut of even just designing it, if you're doing it online, getting it uploaded to the software program that you use in your school or district can be a little tricky. There are different jump logic that can be used and integrated. If you want any help or have any questions around the functionality of the survey in its online form, don't hesitate to contact me or Jeff. And we'll see you through and support you all the way through the design, even into if you have questions about how to use findings. So, yep, we're more than available and excited to help.
Yeah, Stephanie brings up another good point, that it's one thing to give the survey, but in another project that we had, we worked with a district and we surveyed the district, gave them back the results, and then they looked at it and they were like, oh my gosh, what do we do with these? And so it's one thing to give the survey, but to interpret the results is a next step. And so any of that you need help with, let us know.
Great. And our last question asks regarding giving the survey multiple years. Is that something that can be done?
Yeah.
I'm sorry,
definitely.
It's not multiple years, multiple times throughout the year. My apologies.
Yeah, so I'm actually, Jennifer, I'm glad that you asked, that you misasked the question in the first place, because definitely multiple years, giving it over multiple years is a great idea. Like if I were running a school or district, I would give this every year. I want to know how my attitudes are changing. I want to know how my use is changing and so on. Because as I said earlier, the only thing we know is that this will change. I mean, teacher practice is an evolving thing anyway, and teacher data use is new enough to where there are going to be changes. It won't be a static thing. So definitely over multiple years, plan to give this. Multiple times a year, I'm interested to know what you think, Stephanie. I'm a little leery about that because, I don't know, maybe you could give it at the kind of in the fall and in the spring and see how things changed over a year or over the school year. But I probably wouldn't want to do that unless I had some particular initiative during the year that I really wanted to know if it changed attitudes. It's not a lot of time to see a lot of change, and you risk tiring people out. Stephanie, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. I mean, unless there's a targeted initiative aimed and there's professional learning being delivered to teachers and administrators that focuses specifically on how teachers are using data, I'm not sure that administering multiple times during the year is going to really be able to detect those changes that you would hope to see in teacher data use practices. So we'll talk more about administration and administration time periods and things to consider with that during the third webinar. We also talk about a little bit in the guide that accompanies it. But it's going to be, I think, specific to each district and what their needs are and what's going on. But overall, I think you want to give it a little bit of time for a survey to actually be able to detect statistically significant changes that are quantifiable.
Yeah, that's a good point. And somebody just pointed out to me that, you know, if you're in a large urban district, actually a lot of different districts, but definitely a large urban district, is you have attrition to worry about too. You know, so if you give it in the fall and spring, you have some teachers who were or weren't there in the spring that were or weren't there in the fall.
Okay, so I think I'm going, are there any other questions?
Yeah, even if there are, it's probably good to move on and
let
people end on time.
Jeff, if you'll continue to just move the slides for me, that would be great.
Oh, right.
Yep, you can move the slides.
Yeah.
So I'm going to wrap up here in the next 5 minutes and just talk a little bit about Webinar 2, which will be next Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. That's October 21st. We certainly hope you have that marked on your calendar to join us. Jeff talked a little bit today about the ways that the TDUS can be customized. We'll be going into more detail with that next Friday about the process of choosing and selecting what type of data forms you want to use for the particular questions on the survey. We just kind of, you know, glanced over that a little bit today, but we'll delve into that with more detail and how to move into the customization. So really kind of more practical logistics for that. As Jeff said, this is not a generic survey, so you can't just take it off the shelf and give it. It does require customization. We actually think that that's one of the strongest benefits and assets of the survey because it enhances the relevance and utility of findings for educators, gives more meaningful feedback. So that next webinar will focus on the kind of the nuts and bolts, and also gives you all an opportunity. We hope that there's more interaction for that webinar because we want to hear from you all, you know, what you're considering, what you think might be an appropriate data form to include, and how that might unfold in your customized version of the survey. So that's next Friday, October 21st. After this after this webinar, you'll receive an email with links to register for next Friday's webinar, as well as the third and fourth webinars. So as we said, please connect with us. There are various ways that you can do that through Twitter, websites, emails, Facebook, any number of ways. We welcome your questions and your comments. And lastly, we wouldn't be walking the talk about data use if we didn't conclude this webinar without collecting some data on your experience, what you thought. So once you close out of WebEx, you'll get a pop-up with a stakeholder feedback survey. This is through REL Appalachia. So on that form, you'll see some generic survey items as well as some items that are specific to this webinar. Know that if there are any items that don't seem appropriate, you have the option of selecting not applicable. There's also an opportunity for you to provide some written feedback. So because this is a series, if there's anything you want to share with us today that will help us improve our upcoming webinars, we would welcome hearing that. We are here to learn from you and with you, so please don't hesitate to be candid in your responses on the survey. This concludes our webinar for today, and I want to thank you all for taking time to join us. We hope that this was beneficial and informative for you, and we look forward to reconnecting next week. Thank you so much, and have a great day.